For 40 years, he ignored the single most sacred rule in agriculture. Every textbook, every expert, every generation of farmers before him said you must rotate your crops. He planted the same one, season after season on the same ground. And when soil scientists finally tested his fields, they found something impossible. His soil was healthier, richer, and more alive than any rotated field in the entire region. His name is David Westerlund. For 43 harvests on the same Minnesota ground, he has planted only corn. While every farmer around him rotated crops to protect their soil, David bet his farm, his legacy, everything on a different path. He developed a private, intricate system of soil management he told no one about. The question wasn't just if he could grow corn. It was whether his land would turn to dust. And that's why, one morning, two very skeptical soil scientists pulled into his driveway. The scientists from the University of Minnesota Extension were not there to congratulate him. They were there on a rumor, a persistent, agronomically blasphemous rumor floating around the Red River Valley that an old farmer near Halstead had somehow beaten the system. Their mission was simple: test the soil, document the damage, and finally put the myth of successful monoculture to rest. They expected to find hard-pan, lifeless dirt, a cautionary tale. David Westerlund met them at the gate, a man in his mid-70s with eyes that hadn't lost the curiosity of a 30-year-old. He shook their hands, nodded at their equipment, and said, "Took you long enough. The samples are over here." Let me tell you about the rule David broke. Because to understand the sheer scale of his gamble, you have to understand the iron law of crop rotation. It is the foundational principle of sustainable agriculture, taught in every ag school from Cornell to Davis. You grow corn one year, which drains nitrogen from the soil. Then you grow soybeans the next, whose roots host bacteria that pull nitrogen from the air and fix it back into the earth, replenishing what the corn took. It's a perfect natural partnership. It prevents pest cycles, breaks up disease, and maintains soil structure. To not rotate is considered agricultural malpractice. It is the quickest known way to turn fertile topsoil into dead, compacted dirt. Every piece of government advice, every extension agent, every successful farmer for the last century will tell you the same thing: rotate or you will fail. David Westerlund started farming in 1979. He took over 240 acres from his father, Walter, who had farmed it the right way: corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans. Walter was a believer in the system. David was a keen observer. And in the late 1980s, David observed something that planted the first seed of doubt. During a wet fall, he was combining his soybean rotation. The field was a muddy mess. His tractor and combine sank, tearing deep ruts into the soil. He looked across the fence line at his neighbor's field, which was in corn that year. The cornstalk residue, the tougher root structure, had held the ground firmer. It handled the moisture better. In that moment of frustration, David questioned the first sacred cow. What if the constant switching between two completely different root structures and residue types was itself a form of stress on the soil? He began to notice other things. Every spring after soybeans, the soil was soft, almost fluffy, great for planting. But it also eroded more easily with a heavy rain. The corn ground was tougher at planting, but it held. The university said diversity was strength. David started to wonder if consistency might be a different kind of strength, if you could manage for it. Then came the summer of 1988, the drought, one of the worst in Midwest history. Rain stopped in June. By August, the rotated fields around him were burning up. The soybeans withered. The corn was stunted. But in one of David's fields, a second-year corn field where he shouldn't have had corn at all, the plants were still green at the base. The yield was still a disaster, but it was 10% less of a disaster than his rotated field. He walked that field every day trying to figure out why. The only difference he could see was the thatch. The previous year's corn residue, which he hadn't tilled under, lay on the surface like a blanket. It was holding what little moisture was in the soil from evaporating. In a rotated field, soybean residue decomposes too quickly. It doesn't provide that same cover. David's heresy crystallized. What if the problem wasn't the corn itself, but the constant disruption? What if you could build a soil system tailored to one crop and manage it so precisely that it didn't need the reset button of rotation? In 1991, he decided to run an experiment. On a 20-acre plot far from the road, he planted corn, again, for the third year in a row. He told no one, not even his wife, Marion. He knew what people would say. He was young, he was reckless, he was going to ruin his land, but David wasn't just planting corn. He was beginning to build a system. He stopped tilling completely. He left every stalk, every leaf, every root from the previous crop right where it was. He bought a specialized no-till planter that could cut through the residue and place the seed in untouched soil. He began scouring scientific journals not for agronomy, but for soil microbiology and forestry. He was looking for the blueprint of a perennial system, like a prairie or a forest, where the same plants grow in the same place for decades, and the soil gets richer, not poorer. The first 5 years were an exercise in terror. Weeds, especially perennial weeds that loved the undisturbed ground, exploded. David refused to use a tiller. Instead, he walked the rows with a backpack sprayer, spot-treating each weed with herbicide, a brutal, time-consuming process. He spent thousands on custom, slow-release fertilizers, placing them directly with the seed, feeding the plant but not the weeds. He started brewing massive compost teas loaded with fungal and bacterial inoculants, applying them in the fall, trying to mimic the complex microbiome of a natural grassland. He was pouring money and labor into a 20-acre plot that, by all rights, should have been a total loss. His neighbors saw the perpetual cornfield. They saw the weeds. They saw David out there with his backpack sprayer looking like a man trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. The talk started at the co-op. Westerlund's got a problem field. Can't get his rotation right. He's gonna have to plow that under and start over. David heard the whispers. He stopped going to extension meetings. He became a ghost at the local coffee shop. The isolation was part of the plan. He couldn't explain what he was doing because he didn't fully understand it himself yet. He was running on observation, instinct, and a deep, stubborn belief that the textbooks had missed something. Then in year 6, something changed. The weed pressure began to drop, not dramatically but noticeably. The corn plants in the continuous plot looked different. Their roots seemed denser, darker when he pulled one up. The soil itself, when he dug a hole, was darker, crumbly, full of worms. It smelled different, like a forest floor after rain. In his rotated fields, the soil was pale, compacted by machinery. In his secret plot, it was soft and alive. He had no data, only a feeling in his hands. But that feeling was enough for David Westerlund to make the most dangerous decision of his life. In the spring of 1997, he stood in his farm office, looking at the planting map for his entire 240 acres. He took a red marker, and one by one, he crossed out the soybean rotation scheduled for half his land. He wrote corn across every single acre. He was all in, no safety net, no backup plan. He would plant continuous corn on every inch of ground he owned, betting his entire farm, his family's income, his legacy, on a private system that existed only in his head and in the silent biology of his soil. He was walking away from a century of agricultural wisdom, alone. Let me tell you about the first phone call from the extension office, because it came 3 weeks after planting, and it wasn't a friendly check-in. The voice on the other end was Jim Landon, the county extension agent, a man David had known for 20 years. Jim didn't say hello. He said, "David, I'm looking at your planting report from the co-op. It says you bought seed for 240 acres of corn. That's a typo, right? You mean 120 corn, 120 beans." David took a breath. "No typo, Jim, it's all corn." The silence on the line was heavy. "David, you can't do that. You know you can't do that." "The nitrogen drawdown alone." "I'm managing the nitrogen, Jim." "Managing it how? With what? You're going to burn up $200,000 worth of synthetic fertilizer and still end up with compacted garbage. You need the soybean rotation to fix the nitrogen and break up the root zones. This is Farming 101. "What if Farming 101 is wrong?" David asked quietly. The line went quiet again. "Wrong," Jim repeated, his voice flat. "David, I have to file a note with the state on this. You're putting the long-term productivity of your land at severe risk. This isn't just a bad idea. It's a violation of every soil conservation best practice we promote. Your neighbors, their land could be affected by runoff from a degraded field." "My field isn't degraded," David said. "Come out and look at it." "I will," Jim said. "Next Tuesday, 9 a.m. and David, have your soil tests ready from the last 5 years." Let me tell you about that Tuesday, because Jim Landon didn't come alone. He brought a junior agronomist from the university, a PhD candidate named Lisa Cho, who was writing her dissertation on soil carbon sequestration. She carried a digital tablet and a probe. Jim carried a clipboard and a frown. They met David at the edge of the controversial field. It was late May and the corn was 6 inches high, a uniform green carpet. The first thing Lisa noticed wasn't the corn. It was the ground. There was no bare dirt. The space between the rows was covered in a mat of decomposing residue from the previous 3 years of corn stalks, brown, tangled, and spongy. "You haven't tilled," she stated, not asking. "Not since 1991 on this ground," David said. Jim was already shaking his head. "That residue is a nitrogen sink. It's tying up the available N for the new crop. You're starving your plants." "The nitrogen is placed with the seed," David explained. 2 inches below and 2 inches to the side. The residue isn't a sink, it's a blanket. It's keeping the soil temperature even and holding moisture. "Look." He knelt, brushed aside the thatch, and dug his fingers into the soil. It was dark, almost black, and fell apart in loose crumbs. "Now you," he said to Jim. Jim walked 50 yards to the edge of the field to a spot where the residue was thinner. He dug his own hole. The soil was lighter, a pale brown, and came out in a dense clump. He had to knock it against his boot to break it apart. Lisa watched, her scientific curiosity piqued. "Can I take a baseline penetration reading?" she asked. She pushed the metal probe into the ground where David had dug. It slid in smoothly, all 24 inches with almost no resistance. She did the same where Jim had dug. It stopped hard at 8 inches. "Compaction layer," she murmured. Jim's frown deepened. He didn't like data that contradicted his expectations. "One spot doesn't tell the story," he said. "We need grid samples, and we need to see your yield maps from the last 5 years compared to your rotated fields." David led them to his office, a cluttered room in a machine shed. He pulled out file folders, not spreadsheets, hand-drawn maps with colored pencils showing yields by zone. His records were analog, meticulous, and completely idiosyncratic. Lisa scanned them with her tablet. "Your yields, they're stable," she said, surprised. "In your continuous corn fields, they're not declining, they're slightly increasing. 2 bushels per acre per year on average for the last 5 years. "That's impossible," Jim said, looking over her shoulder. "With the nitrogen penalty and disease pressure, you should be seeing a 3 to 5% annual decline. Every study shows this." David pointed to a note on one map. "See that? 1999, that's the year I switched to a fungal-dominant compost tea. The year the weed pressure really dropped. The yield bump came the next year." Lisa looked from the map to David. "You're managing the microbial population. You're trying to steer it." "I'm feeding the fungi," David nodded. "Corn roots like fungi. Soybean roots like bacteria. When you rotate, you flip the whole microbiome upside down every year. It never gets a chance to establish. I'm not flipping it. I'm encouraging one stable system." Jim Landon threw up his hands. "You're encouraging a monoculture of microbes to match your monoculture of plants. That's not resilience, David. That's a house of cards. One disease, one pest adapted to that specific system, and it will wipe you out completely. Rotation is risk management." "Or," David said, locking eyes with Jim, "rotation is a constant disruption that prevents any system, good or bad, from ever forming. What if we've been farming scared?" The report Jim Landon filed with the University of Minnesota Extension did not recommend David Westerlund for any awards. It categorized his operation as high risk, non-compliant with sustainable best practices, and noted anecdotal observations of adequate soil structure in isolated spots, likely due to persistent no-till practice. but insufficient to offset the profound agronomic risks of long-term monoculture. The phrase anecdotal observations was a scientific dismissal. David's data, his hand-drawn maps, his 43 harvests of experience, were relegated to the status of a curious story. The official recommendation was for David to reinstate a corn-soybean rotation on at least 50% of his acreage within 2 years. The report was circulated to the local soil and water conservation district. And because small towns have their own networks, a copy found its way to the front counter of the Halstead Co-op. Let me tell you about the wall of silence that descended, because now it wasn't just whispers, it was official. The university said David was wrong. The extension agent said he was a risk. At the co-op, when David walked in to order his specialized, expensive inoculants, the conversation would stop. Men would nod but not meet his eye. His longtime supplier, a man named Ron, pulled him aside. "David, the guys, they're worried. Jim Landon's report got around. They think you're going to create a superbug or a disease that'll blow onto their fields. They think you're gonna go bankrupt and the bank will sell your land in chunks to some out-of-state corporation." David just listened. "And what do you think, Ron?" Ron sighed. "I think you're the smartest farmer I know, and I think you might be crazy, but my board is asking questions about selling you product that facilitates, and I'm quoting here, environmentally risky farming. I can't lose my other customers, David." David understood. He started ordering his supplies online from out of state, paying a fortune in shipping. The isolation was now economic. Then in 2003, the test came. A new strain of corn rootworm, dubbed the variant, emerged in southern Minnesota. This pest had evolved to circumvent the crop rotation strategy. Its eggs could lay dormant for 2 years, surviving the soybean year, and then hatch perfectly in time for the next corn crop. The very foundation of rotational pest control was cracking. Panic spread through the region. Farmers who had relied on rotation as their primary defense were suddenly vulnerable. They had to spray. They had to use expensive, toxic soil insecticides. David walked his continuous cornfields with a shovel, digging up root balls. His neighbors did the same. Their roots were pruned, nibbled, damaged. David's roots were thick, white, and complex, spreading deep into the soil with little sign of worm feeding. The variant rootworm, it seemed, was not as much of a problem in a field that had never given it a break. The pest never had a chance to build up a huge population because it was always present, always facing whatever predatory microbes and insects David's stable system had fostered. He didn't need to spray. For the first time, a few neighbors looked over the fence not with pity, but with confused curiosity. How was his corn still standing? This event gave David a sliver of credibility, or at least paused the outright dismissal. It allowed Lisa Cho, now Dr. Cho, to secure a small grant, not to study David's success, but to study the anomalous soil parameters on his farm. She could finally bring the full battery of tests. This was the beginning of the rumor that would eventually bring the two scientists to his gate years later. But before the testing could start, David faced a crisis that had nothing to do with bugs or bacteria. It had to do with money. His system was phenomenally expensive. The custom fertilizers, the compost tea brewer he built himself, the shipping costs, the specialized no-till planter parts, it was draining his savings. He was producing good yields, but his input costs were nearly double those of his neighbors. The bank, seeing the extension report and the unconventional practices, labeled him a higher risk. When he went to renew his operating loan in 2005, they demanded a higher interest rate. David did what he always did. He read the contract, and then he did something he'd never had to do before. He had to go to the bank and explain his life's work not to a skeptical agronomist, but to a skeptical loan officer named Keith, who cared only about collateral and cash flow. Keith looked at the spreadsheet. "Your cost per acre is unsustainable, David. You're gambling on premium prices every year just to break even. What's your plan B?" David leaned forward. "Keith, my land is the collateral. What's it worth?" Based on recent sales of similar acreage in Norman County, about $4,200 an acre. And if my soil is significantly healthier, holds more water, and produces more stable yields than that land, what's it worth then? Keith smiled a banker's thin smile. There's no line item for healthier on the appraisal form, David. There's productivity. And your productivity, net of your inputs, is marginal. The bank needs to see a risk mitigation strategy, like planting soybeans on half of it next year. David left the bank that day with the same loan at the higher rate and a sinking feeling. He was running out of time. The world demanded short-term proof, and his experiment was a long-term proposition. He needed data. Hard, irrefutable, university-certified data. He needed Lisa Cho's tests to find something, anything, that a banker could understand. Let me tell you about the sampling day in 2007, because it was the first time David's soil was measured against the world. Lisa and 2 technicians spent 8 hours on his farm, taking 120 core samples. They grid sampled David's continuous corn fields. Then they crossed the road and grid sampled his neighbor's field, a perfect, textbook corn-soybean rotation on the same soil type, farmed by a well-respected, conventional farmer named Gary. They took the samples back to the lab in St. Paul. They tested for everything: macronutrients, micronutrients, organic matter percentage, active carbon, water-stable aggregates, microbial biomass, and the ratio of fungi to bacteria. David waited for 6 weeks. When the email arrived, he opened it with his heart pounding. The first number he saw was the organic matter. His field, 6.2%. Gary's rotated field, 3.8%. David's hands started to shake. Organic matter is the cornerstone of soil health. It holds nutrients, holds water, feeds microbes. A difference that large wasn't a margin of error, it was a different universe. He scanned down. Water-stable aggregates, 48% in his field, meaning nearly half the soil particles clung together even when wet, resisting erosion. Gary's field, 21%. Microbial biomass, off the charts high in his samples. And the fungi to bacteria ratio, 3-to-1 in David's field, a fungal-dominated system like a forest. In Gary's field, it was 1-to-2, a bacteria-dominated system like a vegetable garden. The data was a bomb. It showed David Westerlund's heretical, continuous corn monoculture had soil that was objectively, measurably, and dramatically healthier than the soil of a perfectly managed rotational field right next door. Lisa Cho called him that afternoon, her voice electric with a mix of excitement and scientific terror. "David," she said, "these results, they're going to cause a problem. I have to verify them. I have to resample. This can't be right." But it was right. And now that it was on paper, David Westerlund was no longer just a stubborn old farmer. He was a threat to the entire agricultural establishment. The problem wasn't just that the data was surprising. The problem was what it implied. If David Westerlund's soil was healthier, then the central, unquestioned tenet of modern agronomy, that crop rotation is essential for soil health, had a catastrophic exception. And exceptions are what science hates most. Lisa Cho presented her preliminary findings at a small departmental seminar at the University of Minnesota. She was careful, methodical, highlighting the anomaly while stressing the need for replication. The reaction from the senior faculty was not curiosity, it was defensiveness. A distinguished professor of agronomy, a man who had written textbooks on rotational systems, stood up during the Q&A. "Lisa," he said, his voice calm but edged with ice, "you are comparing a highly managed, input-intensive system to a standard rotational baseline. This isn't a comparison of practices, it's a comparison of budgets. The farmer is essentially using financial inputs to compensate for biological bankruptcy. This isn't a new model, it's a tautology. Spend enough money and you can make anything look good for a while. Where is the economic analysis?" Lisa tried to explain that the soil metrics were independent of economics, but the question had landed. The conversation shifted from "is the soil healthy?" to "at what cost?" David's system was immediately reframed not as a discovery, but as a luxury, a hobby farm for the rich. The official report that was eventually published was gutted. Lisa's full data set was buried in an appendix. The abstract emphasized anomalous soil organic matter accumulation under long-term no-till monoculture, but concluded with the statement, the economic viability and scalability of the intensive management practices required to achieve these results remain unproven, and the long-term ecological risks of fungal-dominant monoculture systems are significant. The word unproven was a bullet. The local newspaper in Hallstatt ran a story with the headline, University Study Questions Local Farmers' Methods. It quoted the unproven and significant risks lines. It did not quote the organic matter percentage. For David's neighbors, the newspaper headline was all the confirmation they needed. The university itself had said he was risky. The wall of silence became a wall of suspicion. At a county soil health workshop a month later, David walked in and took a seat at the back. The presenter, a new extension agent, was talking about the importance of diversity. He put up a slide that said, monoculture equals microbial poverty. A man in the front row, Gary, David's neighbor whose field had been the comparison, turned around, caught David's eye and shook his head slowly, not in anger but in pity. David left before the coffee break. But data, once it exists, has a life of its own. Lisa Cho, stung by the dismissal of her work, did something risky. She presented the full, unvarnished data at a small, interdisciplinary conference on regenerative agriculture in Colorado. This audience was different. They were fringe thinkers, soil ecologists, radical ranchers, people looking for cracks in the conventional wisdom. The reaction was electric. A researcher from the Rodale Institute approached her afterward. A producer for a popular sustainable farming podcast asked for an interview, and a quiet, intensely focused man from the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service asked for the GPS coordinates of David's fields. The data was out, and it was moving in two different worlds, rejected by mainstream agronomy, embraced by the regenerative fringe. David Westerlund was becoming a legend in a community he didn't know existed. Let me tell you about the phone call from Washington, because it came on a Tuesday morning in 2011. The man introduced himself as Dr. Robert Evans from the NRCS. He said he had reviewed Lisa Cho's data and the follow-up samples his own team had quietly pulled from David's and Gary's fields. Mr. Westerlund, he said, we've confirmed the organic matter differential. We've also identified something else. Your soil has a significantly higher concentration of a specific beneficial mycorrhizal fungus, the kind that forms extended networks, moves nutrients, and helps plants resist drought. We believe your compost tea regimen, particularly the fungal component, has selected for it over 2 decades. We'd like to come and see your operation, officially. Robert Evans arrived with 2 colleagues. They didn't wear suits, they wore boots. They spent 3 days on the farm. They didn't just look at soil samples. They interviewed David about every decision, every observation, every failure going back to 1991. They walked the fields at dawn and dusk. They asked about the weather patterns in 1988. They were detectives reconstructing a crime against conventional wisdom. On the final day, over coffee in David's kitchen, Evans laid it out. David, you haven't just been growing corn. You've been performing a 40-year ecosystem engineering experiment. You took a principle from perennial ecology, stability, and applied it to an annual crop system. You've minimized disturbance, you've fed a specific microbial community, and you've accepted that you would have to manage weeds and nutrients differently forever. Rotation is a reset button. You removed the reset button and decided to live in the system, managing it in real time. It's not that rotation is wrong. It's that it's a different tool for a different goal. Your goal was soil building. Their goal is pest and nitrogen management. You've been playing a completely different game. This was the moment of vindication David had waited for, but Evans' next sentence changed everything. We want to publish a case study, a detailed, technocratic report on the NRCS website. It will be your system, your data, your name. And David, you need to understand the reaction will be brutal. The commodity associations, the input companies, the extension system whose entire advising framework is built around rotation, they will come after you. They will attack the economics, they will call it an outlier, They will say you're lying about your inputs. They will try to bury you in paperwork and skepticism. Are you ready for that? David looked at his wife, Marion, who had lived with the isolation, the financial stress, the quiet anxiety for 20 years. She nodded just once. "They've already called me crazy," David said. "Might as well give them a reason." The NRCS case study dropped in the spring of 2012. It was 87 pages of dense, unassailable data. It contained the side-by-side comparisons, the fungal spore counts, the water infiltration rates, the carbon sequestration calculations. It was the data Lisa Cho had wanted to publish, now bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. The agricultural world split open. Let me tell you about the war that followed, because it was a war of narratives. The pro-rotation camp, led by state extension services and the major agronomy departments, went on the offensive. Op-eds appeared in farm journals titled "Beware the Monoculture Miracle." They focused laser-like on the economics. Westerlund's system requires a 60% higher upfront cost per acre, one article stated. This is not a solution for a family farm operating on margin. This is a curiosity for the wealthy or the subsidized. They attack the scalability. How many farmers have 40 years to wait for a fungal network to establish? They ignored the soil health data and talked exclusively about risk and cost. The message was clear. This is dangerous, it's expensive, and you are not David Westerlund. But on the other side, a movement was coalescing. Young farmers, burdened by debt and disillusioned by conventional advice, read the NRCS report like a manifesto. They saw something the professors missed: agency. David's system wasn't about buying more stuff. It was about understanding a biological system and managing it with precision. It appealed to the tinkerer, the outsider, the person who wanted control over their land's destiny rather than following a prescription. David started getting emails, then letters, then phone calls, farmers from Kansas, Ohio, even Australia asking the same question: how do I start? He didn't have a simple answer. He had a story 40 years long. He began spending winters on the phone, walking strangers through the first agonizing steps of killing their tillage equipment and learning to brew compost tea. He never charged a dime. His farm became a pilgrimage site. On any given Saturday, you might find a group of farmers standing in his field, kneeling down to feel the dirt, their faces a mix of skepticism and wonder. This visibility came with a new, more sinister form of pressure. The input dealers in the region saw a direct threat. David's system, at its heart, sought to reduce dependence on synthetic nitrogen and fungicides by building a resilient soil ecosystem. One afternoon, a regional sales manager for a major ag chemical company paid David a visit. He was charming, polite. He praised David's innovative spirit. Then he said, "David, we've been looking at your system. That fungal inoculant you brew, we could license it, we could scale it, we could sell it in a jug. You wouldn't have to mess with brewing it yourself. We could even develop a companion herbicide program that's compatible. Think of the reach you'd have." David listened. He understood the offer. It was an invitation to neuter his discovery, to turn a principle of system management into just another input on the shelf, to make it dependent on them. "My system isn't in a jug," David said. "It's in the patience to not do things. I don't think you can sell that." The salesman's smile didn't falter, but his eyes cooled. "Everything has a price, David, even patience." The message was clear: join us, or we'll find a way to marginalize you. The final and most painful escalation came from where David least expected it: his own family. His son, Mark, had gone to Iowa State, studied agronomy, and returned home with every intention of taking over the farm. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's obsession. He had endured the teasing at school, the silent dinners, the constant financial anxiety. He believed in the data, but he was terrified of the path. One evening, after another difficult conversation with the bank about operating loans for the coming year, Mark confronted his father in the machine shed. "Dad, the numbers don't work. Not for someone starting out. I have student debt. I want to own my own equipment someday, not just maintain your 40-year-old planter. Your system works because you own everything free and clear. You had 40 years to get here. I don't have 40 years. The bank will own me before I'm 40. David saw the fear in his son's eyes, the same fear he had felt in 1997, but now magnified by a world of higher costs and fiercer competition. The soil is the asset, Mark, David said, his voice quiet. I'm giving you the healthiest soil in the county. I know, Mark shouted, his frustration boiling over. And I'm grateful, but Dad, I can't eat soil health. I can't take it to the bank and get a loan for a new truck. They want cash flow. They want last year's yield times last year's price. They don't care about fungi. It was the fundamental, heartbreaking conflict of modern agriculture, the clash between ecological time and economic time. David had bridged it through decades of sacrifice. He wasn't sure his son could, or should, have to do the same. The dream of passing on a legacy was crashing into the reality of passing on a system that the world was not yet built to support. Amid this personal and professional turmoil, a letter arrived from the dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at a major Midwestern university. It was an invitation. They were hosting a summit on the future of soil health, and they wanted David Westerlund to sit on a panel with the very agronomy professors who had dismissed his work. The title of the panel was Challenging Orthodoxy: Case Studies from the Field. It was either a trap or an olive branch. For David, it was something else entirely. It was the battlefield. He knew if he went, he wouldn't just be defending his farm. He would be putting 43 years of lonely work and the future of his son directly in front of the establishment that had called him a fool. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and walked out to his field. The corn was chest-high, whispering in the wind. He knelt down, dug his hands into the dark, fragrant, alive earth that was his life's answer. And he knew what he had to do. The auditorium at the university held 300 people, farmers in seed-cap jackets, academics in blazers, industry reps in polo shirts. David Westerlund sat at a long table on stage, a glass of water in front of him. To his right was Dr. Lisa Cho. To his left was Professor Alan Brewer, the agronomy textbook author who had dismissed her work years before. The moderator posed the first question to Brewer. Professor, given the documented soil health benefits on Mr. Westerlund's farm, does this necessitate a reevaluation of the universal prescription for crop rotation? Brewer adjusted his microphone. He didn't look at David. Soil health is a multivariate equation. Organic matter is one variable. Economic sustainability, pest resilience, and scalability are others. What we see in Norman County is a fascinating outlier, a testament to one man's dedication. But agriculture must provide prescriptions for the millions, not the miracle of the one. Our models, based on thousands of field trials across decades, still clearly show rotation as the lowest risk, most economically viable path for the vast majority of farmers. It was the outlier argument polished for public consumption. The audience nodded. It made sense. Then the moderator turned to David. Mr. Westerlund, your response. Is your system just a miracle for the one? David looked out at the crowd. He saw skeptical faces, curious faces, a few nodding in agreement from the back where the younger farmers had clustered. I didn't come here to sell you a prescription, he began, his voice steady. I came here to sell you a question. For 40 years, I was told I was wrong. My data was called anecdotal. My soil was called an anomaly. My methods were called too expensive. But here's what no one ever asked. What if the reason it looks expensive and risky is because we only measure the cost of the change and never the cost of the status quo? He paused. What is the cost of watching your topsoil wash away in a rainstorm because it has no structure? What is the cost of applying more and more nitrogen every year because your soil can't hold it? What is the cost of a new rootworm variant that makes your primary pest management tool, rotation, obsolete? These are real costs. They're just hidden in different columns of the ledger. They're paid in lost future productivity, in dependency on inputs, in vulnerability. My so-called expensive system was an upfront investment in eliminating those hidden future costs. The soil isn't an outlier. It's a receipt. It's proof that when you stop treating the land like a machine that needs constant correction and start treating it like a living system that wants to be stable, It will reward you. But you have to be willing to pay the price of patience first. And we've built an entire agricultural economy that says patience is a liability. The room was silent. Professor Brewer leaned into his mic. That's a philosophical argument, David, a compelling one, but farmers need practical solutions this spring. They can't wait 40 years for patience to pay off. I agree, David said to everyone's surprise. They shouldn't have to, which is why the question isn't, should everyone do what I did? The question is, what principles from this system can we use right now? No-till, building organic matter, feeding soil biology. These aren't outliers. They're tools. And maybe, he said, finally looking directly at Brewer, the biggest risk isn't trying something new. It's continuing to give advice that ignores a result you can't explain just because it doesn't fit the model. The debate continued, but the energy had shifted. David hadn't won the argument, but he had successfully reframed it. He was no longer a heretic. He was a diagnostician pointing at an unexplained symptom in the body of conventional ag. After the panel, a line of farmers formed to talk to him. Not the young radicals from the back, but older, weathered men in their 60s. One of them, introducing himself as Carl from southern Minnesota, shook David's hand. My organic matter's been dropping for 10 years. I rotate, I no-till, but it's not enough. What's the first thing I should change? David spent 20 minutes with him. This was the real victory. Not convincing the professors, but connecting with the farmers in the trenches who saw the same problems he had seen decades ago. Let me tell you about what happened after the summit, because the battle of ideas was one thing. The battle for the future of David's own farm was another. His son Mark had watched the panel online. That night they talked in the farm office, the same room where David had drawn his red lines years before. Mark spoke first. You were good up there, you made them listen. It doesn't change the loan interest, David said. I know, Mark replied. He took a deep breath. But it changes the story. The NRCS data this panel. It's not just you being stubborn anymore. It's a documented alternative. I talked to the bank again. I showed them the video of the summit. I showed them the NRCS case study. I didn't ask for a loan based on your history. I asked for one based on mine, with a business plan that incorporates the soil health metrics as a long-term asset value. They're considering it. A pilot program with stricter monitoring, but they're considering it. David saw the determination in his son's eyes, a determination forged not from blind faith, but from a pragmatic reassessment of the tools available. Mark wasn't just accepting the legacy, he was figuring out how to finance it. He was building a bridge between ecological time and economic time. 5 years passed. The controversy didn't die, but it matured. David Westerlund's farm was officially listed as a research site with the University of Minnesota, not for agronomy, but for soil ecology. Lisa Cho oversaw the work. They stopped comparing David to his neighbors. They started using his fields as a baseline to ask new questions. How do fungal networks affect drought resilience? How much carbon can truly be sequestered under perennial-like management of an annual crop? David became a reluctant elder statesman of the soil health movement. He still hated the term guru. He preferred head groundskeeper. Then in 2019, the final piece of data fell into place. The economic data. A graduate student named Chloe, working under Lisa, conducted a deep economic analysis of David's farm from 1997 to the present. She accounted for every input cost, every equipment investment, every hour of labor. She compared it not to a generic rotation, but to the actual historical financial records of 3 neighboring rotational farms, adjusting for land size and commodity prices. She was looking for the crossover point. The year David's expensive system started to be cheaper than the standard system. She found it. In year 12 of continuous corn, year 2008, David's cumulative net profit, despite his higher costs, surpassed the average of his neighbors. The soil health had translated into yield stability that weathered poor price years and drought years better than the rotated fields. The reduced need for certain pesticides and the slowly decreasing nitrogen requirements began to offset the cost of his compost and inoculants. By year 20, His average annual net profit per acre was 18% higher. The report's conclusion was simple: the system is not a luxury. It is a long-term investment with a quantifiable payoff. It requires upfront capital and risk tolerance, but it is, over a generation, more economically resilient. The outlier had a spreadsheet. Let me tell you about the last conversation with Jim Landon, the extension agent who had first come to warn him. It was 2021. Jim was retired. He stopped by the farm on a fall afternoon, not as an official, but as a neighbor. They sat on the porch watching the combines roll in the distance. "I read that economic study," Jim said. "I guess I owe you an apology." David shook his head. "No, you don't. You were doing your job." The job was to protect farmers from catastrophic risk. I was a catastrophic risk. Jim smiled. "Maybe, but I was also protecting an idea, and the idea was too small." He sipped his coffee. "We were taught to see agriculture as a problem of efficient production. You saw it as a problem of system design. I spent my career giving people the keys to a car. You spent yours building a better engine. I just didn't recognize it. It was the reconciliation the story needed. Not a victory, but an understanding." Today, David Westerlund is semi-retired. Mark runs the day-to-day operations. He hasn't slavishly copied his father's system. He's adapted it. He uses some modern biological inputs David never tried. He's experimenting with interseeding cover crops into the standing corn, a hybrid approach. The system is evolving, as living things do. The original 240 acres are still in continuous corn. The soil organic matter now averages 6.8%. The farm is debt-free. Let me tell you the final, surprising detail, because it's not about David. It's about Gary, his neighbor, the one whose field was the original comparison. For years, Gary was the symbol of the right way. Then in 2017, he started making changes. He went no-till on all his acres. He started using a fungal-rich inoculant. He even tried a 3-year stretch of corn on a quarter section, just to see. He never converted fully to David's monoculture path. But he took the principles: reduce disturbance, feed biology, build organic matter, and folded them into his rotation. Last year, his soil organic matter tested at 4.9%, up a full point from when Lisa Cho first sampled it. At the co-op one morning, Gary saw David. He walked over, clapped him on the shoulder, and said, "You know, for a guy who never rotates crops, you sure got a lot of the rest of us to change." David laughed. It was the ultimate validation. His legacy wasn't a prescription for monoculture. It was a proof of concept for patience, observation, and the courage to question the most fundamental rule in the book. The goal was never to get everyone to stop rotating. It was to get everyone to think about why they rotate and what they might be missing. The 2 soil scientists who came to his gate that first day, expecting a cautionary tale, published a paper. Its title didn't mention David Westerlund. It was called "The Hidden Potential of System Stability in Annual Crop Production." In the acknowledgments, it read, "The authors thank the farmer for 43 years of meticulous observation." For David, that was better than any headline. He had moved from an anecdote in a dismissed report to a threat, to a case study, and finally to an acknowledgement. The journey was complete. So what does the story of David Westerlund actually prove? It doesn't prove that crop rotation is wrong. The data from 1 million fields still supports it. What it proves is something more profound and more dangerous to any established system. It proves that a single, determined observer, willing to endure decades of doubt and isolation, can find a crack in the foundation of what everyone knows to be true. It proves that the deepest form of innovation isn't always inventing something new, but in having the patience to question why the old thing must be so, and the courage to accept the answer, even when it comes from the quiet of your own field, one season at a time, for 43 seasons. David's legacy isn't a new prescription for planting. It's a permission slip. A permission to look at the foundational rules of your own world, whether you're a farmer, a teacher, an engineer, or an artist, and ask the terrifying question: what if this rule exists not because it's the only way, but because it's the only way we've bothered to look? His victory wasn't in beating the system, but in proving that the system was narrower than the possibilities of the world it tried to describe. The next time you hear an unshakable rule, a piece of universal advice, remember the farmer who planted corn. Remember that the most important discoveries often begin not with a breakthrough, but with a simple, stubborn observation that something doesn't add up, and that the cost of being wrong for a long time can be far less than the cost of never questioning what you've been told is right. Thank you for watching. If you found a new perspective here, consider subscribing. We search for more stories of quiet obsession that change the way we see the world.